Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 mod roundup. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be showcasing 15 more awesome mods that I've been really enjoying trying out that I haven't yet featured on the channel. Some of them are newer, some are older, but they're all interesting, fun, and very much worth checking out. As usual, most of the mods we'll be talking about will be available on every platform, including console, Mac, and PC, but we do have a couple PC-only mods that I wanted to talk about, and because I'm covering those and a few smaller utility mods, we'll be talking about 15 mods instead of the usual 10. So hopefully there will be something for everyone, no matter what you're looking for. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to HC Simpataja for the €5 donation, David Ramos for the $2, Alistair Plays for the $50, and Andremini Hart, Fish Nabubu, and SBH001 for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk mods. First up, a class mod that I've really been enjoying, the Duskblade. Duskblade is a hybrid melee and spellcasting character, which is a type of character archetype that's still pretty underrepresented in 5th edition. Obviously, Baldur's Gate has taken some steps to rectify this, with things like sword bards and hexblades being so prominent in the game, but it's still a character type that you have to play some pretty specific combinations of classes and build in certain specific ways in order to make functional. Duskblade is a really cool example of this archetype that's one that a lot of people, myself included, really enjoy playing. And it's a 3rd edition class. It's from D&D 3.5, but has never officially been updated to 5th edition. There's some pretty cool homebrew versions of it, though, and the mod author has taken one of those as a base and then updated it to work in Baldur's Gate 3 to bring this really cool class from earlier Dungeons & Dragons editions into Baldur's Gate. The Duskblade has 6 different available subclasses, which is huge for one mod, obviously. The Spell Shield, Spell Blade, Spell Soul, Spell Knight, Spell Strider, and Spell Eye. Each of them I have found plays quite differently and accomplishes what it's trying to do. There's some balance issues with a couple of the subclasses, but for the most part I found that the Duskblade, while high on the power curve, is not as powerful as something like a Hexblade or a Sword Bard. And so you also get to play this hybrid character while having a real approach to the balance of the game instead of just breaking it in half the way you often do with hybrid characters in Baldur's Gate 3. The abilities all focus around using combinations of spells and then attacking. You get this quick cast ability, where if you use a spell, you can then make a free weapon attack, so kind of like the opposite of an Eldritch Knight. And when you hit enemies with your Arcane Channeling ability, they become more vulnerable to your spells. So you end up being able to combine whether you're attacking first in order to give enemies the disadvantage with spell power, or whether you're casting first in order to get the bonus attacks, which is kind of a cool feature and an interesting decision point that you have to make most turns of combat. You get tankier as you level up as well and get more access to additional casting, so that you can often have a lot of decisions to make, and that's one thing I really like. Also, I appreciate that the spellcasting is intelligence-based, because normally in Baldur's Gate 3, only wizards ever want to increase intelligence, so it gives you another character that can actually be a little bit brainier. The different subclasses, I'm not going to go through all of the things that they get, but basically Spell Knights and Spell Shields are a little bit tankier and can focus on resisting enemy spells or resisting enemy attacks. Spell Blades have critical hits and accuracy bonuses, which are pretty cool, so it can make you a more offensive version of the Duskblade. And there's even the Spell Eye, which has archery-focused abilities. I also really like the Spell Strider, which is kind of like a more magical ranger, focusing on a lot of mobility tools, so it's very cool. I also want to say shout out to the mod author for just including a table. Really helpful to see all of the abilities just laid out here, depending on what subclass you have. I think that more mod authors should do this, because at a glance, it gives you the ability to see what you're going to be getting at every level. So very cool there. Really appreciate that. Overall, I've found that the Duskblade plays out exactly how I had hoped. It feels like playing a Duskblade in 3.5, which is a class I played a lot in tabletop. And it works exactly as you would want it to in Baldur's Gate 3, giving you a whole other option for a Gish character, which is something that is has to be built in pretty specific ways normally, so having a class that's dedicated to that is really cool. So highly recommend the Duskblade. Conjure animals and summon beasts. So this adds a spell line that's available in tabletop D&D, but for some reason never made it into Baldur's Gate 3, even though all of these animals have stats and models and everything and are implemented in the game. So it's just a weird gap that I've always wondered why Druids and Rangers didn't get this spell line in Baldur's Gate. So this mod fixes that. This allows Druids and Rangers to summon various beast-themed summons, various animals, things like eagles, badgers, bears, a lot of the ones that Rangers can summon as companions, and a lot of the enemies that you'll face as various beasts throughout the game are summonable. And just gives you a whole variety of different summons that you can use in various situations, depending on which are most tactically appropriate, and also which are cutest. This is a pretty powerful set of tools for Rangers and Druids, and in particular, having a summon spell that summons a combat companion at level 2 is pretty strong. So there is definitely some change to the balance, but it is also true that Druid level 2 spells are already heavily contested, so adding another good spell isn't as big a change to the balance as it would be for, say, Clerics whose level 2 spells aren't typically as strong. I really like the way that this mod was implemented in 2 different spell lines and with proper scaling as you upcast them. I also like the fact that there are 16 different animals, and you can... I also really like these blurry screenshots. But you can see the various implementations using the models that already exist in the game. Many of them are extremely powerful, and many of them are really fun to use. There's lots of different abilities, and being able to add in the Beastmaster Ranger effects to other parties is also really interesting and can lead to a lot of new tactical options. You can also, yes, summon a dinosaur, which is great. So this really fills a gap, especially if you're intending to play a summoner playstyle, or if you just, like me, wondered where these spells went in Baldur's Gate 3, because they're some of the most iconic spells for Druids, especially in tabletop. The really fun part about using these spells, though, I think is actually for Rangers. They're very good for Druids, but Druids already get pretty solid summons. But giving Rangers a really powerful option to use their level 2 and level 3 spell slots on means that it's much more useful to actually cast spells as a Ranger. In Baldur's Gate 3, the way that Rangers have kind of ended up a lot of the time is just as pure martial characters that use their spell casting almost exclusively for supporting spells to enhance their martial abilities in some way, whether that be, blinding enemies with Fog Cloud or keeping them trapped with spike growth. Mostly you're just using that to make sure that your archery lands more easily. So having a spell that actually does something and makes use of your Ranger spellcasting both is very powerful and also gives you some really interesting tactical options for a class that can sometimes lack them. It also gives you an incentive to keep leveling up in Ranger, which a lot of Ranger builds in vanilla Baldur's Gate will stop at level 5 or so, and so having access to more animals is a real reason to keep leveling up, so I think that that's very cool as well. I also, again, want to shout out the mod author for these weirdly cropped, blurry screenshots. This is what I like to see, a little bit of, homemade jank in a mod. Weightless Consumables. So this is a very old mod. It last updated in 2024, but it still works and still fills a pretty important and useful quality of life niche, and I think is one of the better implementations of this effect around. This turns every consumable in the game weightless, and also, importantly, things like camp supplies, gold, and dyes also become weightless, in addition to scrolls and potions and poisons and grenades and stuff like that. There's, of course, a lot of debate about whether modding out carry weight is egregiously cheating, and it definitely can be if you're using it to stack, a million explosive barrels and carry those around, but most of the time, getting rid of the carry weight on things like this just makes it easier to appropriately dye all of your armor sets, because you can just keep all your dyes on one character. So it just adds a lot of quality of life to a playthrough. Personally, I tend to, when I play casually and not for testing honor mode builds, I just turn carry weight off entirely, but I think that this strikes a pretty good middle ground where the things like dyes that you really want to be able to just access at any time that you want a change of clothes, you can just carry around all the time. It also makes carrying a bunch of gold not so much of an imposition as it is in Baldur's Gate normally. This was more important before the camp chest worked as well, but is still pretty helpful, so I just really like this small utility mod, and if you want to get rid of carry weight, this is a good way to do it. Another utility mod, this one definitely cheating, but sometimes you just want to be able to make the game easier or faster, Conjure Infinite Gold. This just allows you to summon an entire stack of 99,000 gold into your inventory. You probably want to make gold weightless if you're going to do this. And it can shortcut doing things like doing all the vendor exploits or whatever. There are lots of ways to get infinite gold in Baldur's Gate 3 through various exploits. And if you were going to do that anyways, just use a mod, save yourself some time and some headaches. This is an easy one to do it. You can also use like the cheater's spell scroll, but if you were going to just do gold exploits and don't want the temptation of using all of the other cheats, then this is a lightweight way to do it that doesn't give you all of that other temptation if you're planning to do a slightly more exploit-heavy playthrough. Personally, not one that I use, but if you are intending to get infinite gold through vendor manipulation, just use this instead. Immortal Scratch. So this is a very small mod that just makes Scratch completely immune to damage and harmful effects, so that you can just have him with you all the time without the risk of having him blown up. Obviously, Scratch is a very good dog, and you don't want him to suffer, so making him completely immortal can allow you to just keep him around all the time and not worry about it. There's various reasons that you might want this, either just to not have to worry about, having to resummon him and all of that, having to not have him in danger if you do get in a fight at camp where he can die, not having harm to animals, which of course many people can have trouble with for various reasons, and if that's you, then this is a great way to avoid having to deal with that. So lots of reasons that you might want this, mostly just because it's kind of fun. You can also use it to just have him completely solo encounters by sending Scratch in on his own and being invincible. A little more cheaty, but that is also very funny. Homebrew Blade Cantrips. So this adds 10 new Blade Cantrips, so these are attack-based melee cantrips like Booming Blade, to the game, each of which has a different and unique effect. Now, importantly, these are not implemented the same way that Booming Blade is in Baldur's Gate 3. They're implemented the way Blade Cantrips work in Tabletop 5th Edition, where they actually take your whole action to cast rather than just a single attack. This makes them a little bit more balanced when spread across multiple characters, and unlike Booming Blade, doesn't end up sort of taking over the whole game by just adding free damage to any melee attacker that has access to it. So I tend to like this implementation a little bit more, and I think that the Blade Cantrips both add a lot of fun variety to melee characters, and combined with the Blade Cantrip Adept feat, which allows you to make an extra attack after you use a Blade Cantrip and also get access to some of these, enables some new and unique builds built around this effect. Being able to have a sword crackling with lightning or suddenly catch fire is such an iconic image in fantasy games, and Dungeons & Dragons weirdly doesn't actually give you much access to this outside of magic items, and so having these blade cantrips available makes this something that you can do with the power of your actual magic, which is just very cool. Of the 10 cantrips, I think that they're all reasonably well balanced. They're mostly minor effects. The one that I would point to as being maybe a little bit problematic is the Tidal Blade, which can knock enemies prone after they end their turn. They'll have to make a strength save or fall prone. Having prone on a cantrip is definitely a little dangerous, but it is at the end of their turn, and it has to be a melee attack with this spell, so it's not the end of the world, but I did want to call that one out as being maybe a little bit over the power curve. But the others I've found all pretty well balanced and really fun. There's one that does damage when the enemy uses a reaction, one that does damage whenever they fail a dexterity save for the rest of the turn, one that does damage whenever they approach one of their allies, the lightning one, and a lot of other different effects across the 10 cantrips. So they're all cool, they're really fun to play with, and they add a whole bunch of fun dimensions to, again, any Gish character, any character that wants to do spellcasting and melee attacks, as well as a whole dedicated build using the feat. Really cool, really fun to play around with, definitely worth checking out. Transmogrification Lite. So this is, of course, a mod and a feature in the game that people have been desperate for since the game launched, the ability to make your equipment look like another piece of equipment in the game. Many games, and especially more modern games, have entire transmog systems where you can turn the stats from one equipment with you can combine the stats from one equipment with the appearance from another piece of equipment, and often you can create really interesting outfits without sacrificing stats, because there's lots of really cool models. Things like the ring mail, which looks really cool but is completely useless in game. Being able to actually equip your character with that, I think, is really cool. This is a fairly lightweight version of the mod that just gives you a spell that allows you to create a new item that has the stats from one item and the appearance of another. So if you're wearing an item, you target the spell at another item of that type, and then it'll make an item with the stats from one and the appearance of another. It can also create invisible versions of items that still take an equipment slot to equip, but have no appearance at all. So if you just want to look like you're not wearing a cloak, but still get the benefits of the Cloak of Protection, you can do that. There's some pieces of armor in the game that I do not think are particularly cute, but like the Graceful Cloth, for example, but that end up in a lot of builds, and your characters can end up looking pretty silly. So the ability to make that look like one of the more cool looking pieces of armor in the game is really fun. One of the really great things about Baldur's Gate is there are so many really cool outfits, and unfortunately you often don't get to use them, and your characters, especially when you've done multiple playthroughs, can end up taking on very samey sorts of appearances as the same pieces of armor show up over and over again. So having the ability to vary that up and change the look of your characters is great. Honestly, I don't really know why I'm trying to sell you on transmog systems. If this is something you want, you know that it's something you want. And I have found this to be a very good and fairly lightweight and easy to use implementation of it. I've run into a couple bugs with the meshes disappearing, so sometimes you'll have to like remake an item in order to have the item appear again, because I have had a couple disappearing items from using this, but nothing that I haven't been able to fairly easily solve. So while there are some bugs, nothing major that I've personally run into, and being able to change the appearance of your characters is really nice and can let you actually customize the outfits for your characters much more extensively. Speaking of customizing your characters, all camp clothes and dyes. This is a fairly simple mod, but one that is really cool. It gives you all of the camp clothing and dyes from the beginning of the game. This can allow you to just dress your characters the way that you want to, and without having to wait until those clothes show up in the game. I do personally think that it's actually very cool the way that it works out in your sort of first playthrough of Baldur's Gate, where your characters reach the big city and suddenly have access to all sorts of new fashions, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who spent a bunch of time going to all of the clothing vendors and redressing my characters now that they've reached the city and have access to a bunch of cool different clothing and dyes. But that was very exciting the first time around, and now that I've played the game many times, I really want to have access to some of the cool outfits from the beginning so that my characters can have the looks that I sort of picture in my head for them right from the start of the game, and so this allows you to do that. Also, you get to play with the dyes right from the beginning, which can give you a much better picture of what things will actually look like, and not having to scrounge around for the right dye for your characters means that you can get your characters looking the way you want to right from the beginning. So small utility mod, but very fun, and allows you, again, to customize your characters quite a bit. There's also a small companion mod to this mod that adds more copies of these clothing and dyes to vendors throughout the game so that you can restock, and if you want multiple copies of the same clothing, you can buy a second copy. So an easy way to do that as well. Next up, the Mindflayer Race Mod. So this allows you to play as a Mind Flayer and a Lithid, which of course is something that many players really want to do and are very excited to do. Or more accurately, it allows you to transform yourself into an Illithid by equipping the Mind Flayer underwear, which is just a very funny thing to exist in the game, so that really tickled my fancy as well. The reason that it uses the underwear instead of just adding Mind Flayer as a race option to the game is that this works on console, and a lot of race mods either don't work or are a little bit janky on consoles because they have to edit files that are only available to edit on PC. So by implementing it as a transformation based on Disguise Self, this one works just fine on console and allows you to play as a Mind Flayer, so that's just very cool. There are lots of interesting character choices you can make if you're playing as a Mind Flayer throughout Baldur's Gate, and some of the especially evil endings make a lot of sense if you're a Mind Flayer player character. Now, this does give you access to obviously extremely broken abilities, because it just gives you the whole Mind Flayer ability tree, including endgame Mind Flayer abilities. So you have to either exercise some restraint if you want to play it balanced and not use those abilities until later in the game, or just accept that you're a Mind Flayer, one of the most powerful creatures in the entire Forgotten Realms, and you're just going to be overpowered as a result. But this is a good way to implement something that a lot of players want, and being a Mind Flayer in Baldur's Gate 3 is just very cool. Next, an extremely simple mod, SharDeityUnlocked. All this lets you do is pick Shar as your deity if you are playing as a cleric who's not Shadowheart. Normally, this is disabled for any character other than Shadowheart at game start, so with this mod, you can do that. The game will let you choose to worship other evil gods, so it doesn't make complete sense other than that they wanted Shar to be Shadowheart specific, that you can't pick Shar. And also it's just kind of fun for the flavor of it if you want to just bro out with Shadowheart, especially in a more evil run. So just a small utility mod that gives you one more option for your gameplay. Next up, a mod that's currently PC only, but that I think will probably be coming to consoles in the next console mod drop. Chocolate Edition Witch. So I've previously recommended Chocolate Edition, which is an overhaul mod that rebalances and remakes a lot of Baldur's Gate 3. I found it a really fun implementation, and Chocolate Edition Witch is a class mod that's an expansion to that overhaul mod. This is very cool because one thing that Baldur's Gate 3 is missing from its stable of classic fantasy archetypes is a real witch. You kind of have to hack together something using warlocks or wizards or something like that, but the sort of potion brewing, familiar-based, more ritual magic approach that is so archetypal of a witch in fantasy is kind of absent from Dungeons & Dragons. So I'm always interested in seeing people's attempts to recreate this, and I think that the Chocolate Edition one does a really good job. This is a kind of eclectic, short rest-based half-caster, so fairly similar to a warlock, but with a little bit less pure magical power, but also which has a short rest ability, kind of like Bardic Inspiration, called Wits, that allows you to do various actions. There are several subclasses available, and they can either be the sort of mobile Wild Dancer, the Conjurer, which is more familiar-based, or the Sibyl, which is kind of luck manipulation. That one's my favorite, you can probably imagine. And they play somewhere between a bard and a warlock, I have found, with a little bit of wizard mixed in there as well. I think that that is a very cool niche for a character to play, and again, is something that's kind of hard to build just through multi-classing, so having the witch class fill that character archetype gives you an option that wasn't available before. One thing that I really like in homebrew class mods is when they're a little bit on the weaker side, and I think that Witch is generally a little below the standard curve for power level, though still very playable. And I really appreciate that in a homebrew class because so many homebrew classes are wildly overpowered, so one that is well balanced or even a little bit undertuned, which gives you some room to optimize with it, I tend to find very fun. The upside of the character, from a kind of power standpoint, is that they get a little bit of everything, and they have really good hit points and a kind of odd mix of spells that just doesn't exist in other classes. So you get tactical options that just aren't available to other characters. Combine that with the bag of tricks that you get from your Wits ability, and you get a character that really does feel like a magical dabbler, someone who is kind of putting together these spells on their own, either through a passed on tradition or without formal training, and is able to create these cool effects by scraping together things that other casters wouldn't necessarily think to use. So it really feels on theme to me and works very well, and you also have to make a lot of cool tactical decisions between your somewhat odd spell list and all of the abilities that the characters have. So very successful, in my opinion, implementation of a witch. It feels really witchy as you're playing it, and that's really what you're looking for when you want this type of mod. Next, a mod that fixes one of my longest standing minor frustrations with the game, Arcane Interference Arrow Fix. So the Arcane Interference Arrow applies a turn of silence when you hit an enemy with it, which sounds like it's going to be really cool. So when you shoot an enemy, they get silence for a turn, and then in theory they can't cast spells. Unfortunately, the way that it's implemented in Baldur's Gate doesn't actually function at all, because the silence ticks down at the start of the enemy's turn. It's one of the conditions that ticks down at the start of their turn. So you shoot them with a turn of silence, and then that silence goes away at the beginning of their turn, and they just get to cast spells anyways. So Arcane Interference can only be used to prevent reaction-based spells, some of which actually go through silence, and so it basically doesn't function and does not do the thing that it's supposed to do. This is a, unfortunately, PC-only fix that just makes it apply 2 turns of silence, though, again, because this condition ticks down at the beginning of the enemy turn, they'll only be silenced for 1 actual turn. Just makes this item work the way that it is supposed to, and fixes a long-standing bug or design issue that really kind of bothers me in the game, so I'm glad that somebody fixed it. Very similarly, another small fix to some arrows, though this one does make the associated class significantly more powerful, so you do have to be aware of that, the Sharpshooter Arcane Archer fix. Effectively, what this means is that Sharpshooter, the feat that adds 10 damage to your arrow shots, will apply to Seeking and Piercing Arrow. The way that those spells are implemented or those attacks are implemented in Baldur's Gate is they're implemented as spells instead of as attacks. Seeking Arrow is basically a copy of Magic Missile that uses your weapon damage, and Piercing Arrow is just an AoE damage spell that uses your weapon damage, so neither of them use Sharpshooter. And you can maybe argue that because they don't make attack rolls, Sharpshooter shouldn't work, in which case don't install the mod, but typically I think people will expect Sharpshooter to work with those abilities because you're firing them out of a bow, and as implemented it doesn't. It's also even worse because in Baldur's Gate 3 the Sharpshooter damage will show up in the tooltips in a lot of places, even though it doesn't actually apply when you fire the arrows. So a mod that fixes that is really nice and makes the arrows behave the way most players are going to expect them to, so that when you use these guaranteed hit arrows, you actually get the benefits of Sharpshooter. This, I think, is obviously a fairly substantial buff to an already powerful class, but just having the game work the way you expect it is worth a lot. Again, only PC only, unfortunately, but just a really nice fix. And finally, a super fun Cantrip mod. Again, tragically PC only, but this one's just so much fun. The Chaotic Blast Wild Magic Cantrip. So basically, this is Eldritch Blast, except that it randomizes the damage type, and also is capable of triggering Wild Magic Surges if you're playing a Wild Magic Sorcerer. So it's a very thematic cantrip for a Sorcerer. Being able to trigger Surges with a cantrip is definitely a buff to the Wild Magic Sorcerer. Surges are typically going to be advantageous for you, and having to spend a spell slot to trigger them is part of the balancing factor. So this does make the character more powerful. But this is just so much fun because it randomizes the damage type when it hits a target, which it's just fun to see that happening. And there will be times when you're hitting an enemy which has resistance to one damage type and vulnerability to another, and you get to kind of roll the dice, which adds some fun and some chaos. Again, if you're playing a wild magic sorcerer, that's what you want. And then the ability to trigger surges with a cantrip can make for just ridiculous fun. So I think that this is a really cool mod, and I've really enjoyed playing with it, both with wild magic sorcerers and with other characters. Finally, before I finish the video, I do want to take a second to talk about where the Baldur's Gate 3 videos have been, because I'm sure a lot of you have been wondering about that. I haven't really sort of formally mentioned it, but I haven't been posting Baldur's Gate 3 for a couple months, so I'm sure many of you have been wondering why not. Basically, I had just, at the beginning of the summer, more or less done all of the things that I had wanted to do in Baldur's Gate 3 for a bit, and so I wasn't really excited to try new stuff. Doing some more recent modded playthroughs, as you can see from my mod roundup video here, has really rekindled my interest. And I do think that it is something that I always want to emphasize, is that I shouldn't post something if it's just going through the motions. I only want to make a video if I'm excited about that video. I think otherwise it's unfair to you guys, and I never want to be insincere about stuff that I'm posting. So basically that, combined with it's been, for various personal reasons, a somewhat difficult couple of months, meant that I wasn't hyper interested in posting Baldur's Gate, and didn't have the energy to really dig into another playthrough. That has changed a bit, so now I am jumping back in, and you can expect more Baldur's Gate 3 videos coming soon. I already have another one partially recorded and in the works, and then we've got a couple more on the way. So for those of you who have been waiting, thank you for waiting. I appreciate your patience, as I have been, posting other games and stuff. And we will be back to a lot more Baldur's Gate, and also exploring other RPGs and other character building stuff in a little more detail. Right now I've been a little more doing games that are easy to just dive into for just a little bit and just put together a video based on one run, rather than having to do a bunch of research, because I just haven't had as much time. So I really appreciate your patience. Thanks as always for watching, and hopefully that gives you some idea of what's been going on. Alright, my friends, thanks for watching, and of course, if you have enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment and hit that like button. We're back to Baldur's Gate, so that's very exciting. As always, of course, if there are mods that you think I should check out, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for more interesting mods to take a look at. Yeah, it's great to be back. Thanks for watching, my friends. Of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. Catch you next time.